Hello and welcome to The Edge, where we'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. To make a start with our look beyond the edge. Afghan officials say that Turkey's running and guarding of Kabul airport following the US troop withdrawal from the country will ensure the security of the diplomatic community, adding that the Afghan government is fully supportive of Turkey's presence at Kabul airport. But how important will the Turkish presence be for the unity and stability of Afghanistan? The European Union's governing body has recommended that the bloc lift restrictions of non-essential travel from 14 countries, including the United States, a move that would allow visitors from these destinations to take vacation in Europe far more easily. However, residents in the United Kingdom are waiting for the easing of restrictions there. What went wrong with the UK, and is the easing of restrictions a risk for the months following the travel season? The number of people fleeing wars, violent persecution and human rights violations rose last year to nearly 82.4 million people, a further 4% increase on top of the already record high of 79.5 million recorded at the end of 2019. What can the international community do in order to stop the soaring displacement? These are the top three issues that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. The withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan plays an important factor in the Afghan peace process. Our following infographic gives an overview of the US troops' presence in Afghanistan. The head of Afghanistan's negotiating efforts has welcomed Turkey's commitments in the country at a key time in which peace talks are ongoing.
The head of Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation says that Turkey's presence at Kabul International Airport is important given that the Taliban are trying to take advantage of the relative vacuum left in the wake of the withdrawal of foreign troops from the country.
As a person in the politics of Afghanistan, personally, of course, I welcome the role of the Turkey as far as supporting Kabul International Airport is concerned. And of course, the details need to be worked out between two governments, and also Turkey will continue its discussions with the United States and perhaps some other countries of NATO countries. That's separate from that. I express my own views about it, which I am supportive of that idea.
Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu also said that the operation and security of the airport are very important for Afghanistan, describing it as the country's gateway to the world. Emphasizing that it is not an obligation that Turkey will undertake alone, Çavuşoğlu said that Turkey needs support from important countries and allies, but above all from Afghanistan itself. US President Joe Biden's national security advisor said that Turkey would play a leading role in providing security at Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport after NATO forces withdraw from Afghanistan.
The people of Afghanistan want the peace process to bear fruits as soon as possible. In the sooner the better. That's the view of the people of Afghanistan.
Biden has ordered the withdrawal of all US forces from Afghanistan by September the 11th, the 20th anniversary of America's longest war, believing that no more can be achieved.
I'm now joined live from Washington, D.C. by Michael Kugelman, who's a foreign policy expert. Michael, thank you for joining us here today on The Edge. The countdown is well underway for the United States troops to be leaving Afghanistan on the 11th September, about 10 or 11 weeks from now, so not very much time left. Could you just briefly outline for us the current situation in Afghanistan? Why did Joe Biden feel confident that the US troops could be removed, and what are the immediate consequences of that?
Yeah, well, the situation on the ground in Afghanistan is very troubling. I mean, we've been seeing really ever since the U.S. and the Taliban signed an agreement in February of 2020, we've seen the Taliban scaling up its offensives and scaling up attacks. But ever since President Biden announced his withdrawal from Afghanistan, we've seen those offensives stepped up even more, to the point that at this point in time, you have about 4 or 5 provincial capitals in Afghanistan that have been surrounded by the Taliban. And the Taliban has been pushing so strongly in its offensives that in some cases you've had Afghan troops laying down their arms and actually surrendering to the Taliban. So it really is a very troubling state of affairs, though what I've laid out is not what led President Biden to decide to leave Afghanistan. For President Biden, the issue related to the risk of transnational terrorism. President Biden had said that there is not a sufficiently serious terrorism threat emanating from Afghanistan to the United States to justify the U.S. staying there. And what President Biden had said was that the U.S. achieved its initial goals of wiping out al-Qaeda sanctuaries, and that the terrorism threat in Afghanistan is simply not serious enough to warrant the U.S. remaining there. Unfortunately, that does not mean that this very troubling situation in Afghanistan with the insurgency and with the violence would prompt him to stay on in Afghanistan. So unfortunately, what you have happening here is U.S. forces continuing their withdrawal, which, as you noted, it's going to be done very soon. The Taliban is not targeting U.S. forces. They're okay as they leave, but the Taliban is hitting Afghan soldiers, Afghan troops, and Afghans on the whole, hitting them harder than at any time ever before. So, for the Afghan people, obviously they're going to pay the biggest price, and it really is a very troubling state of affairs.
In fact, maybe the Taliban, as Abdullah said when he visited Turkey at the weekend, he said Taliban trying to take advantage of relative vacuum after the withdrawal of foreign troops in the country. In a sense, it's not surprising that they're not attacking the Americans, because they want them to go away, because then that leaves the ground more open for them. But there were hopes that they would come to a conference in Istanbul, a peace conference. What is happening with the peace talks? Have they totally broken down, or are they likely to happen any time?
Well, I think it's unlikely we'll see any type of progress with peace talks until the U.S. troop withdrawal is complete. I mean, the Taliban has been quite clear on that. The reason why it refused to attend that conference in Turkey that you mentioned before is that there were still U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And so I think that we'll have to wait until September, or perhaps even later in July, whenever the final withdrawal is complete, to get a sense of the Taliban's intentions. And I would argue that the Taliban, by ramping up its fight and by surrounding provincial capitals, it's doing one of two things. Either it's trying to essentially prepare the grounds for an effort to take over the entire country and to seize the government by force once the U.S. Withdrawal has been completed, or it is trying to ratchet up its bargaining position as high as possible. In other words, trying to strengthen its bargaining position as much as possible by doing as much as it can on the battlefield, so that it can say to the Afghan government after U.S. troops have gone, well, look, now we're ready to talk. Let's discuss a settlement. And it would come to those talks from a position of great strength, because obviously Afghan forces would be under so much pressure, the Afghan government would be under so much pressure, given that it would be having Taliban forces surrendering city centers and so forth. In terms of which of those two scenarios will play out, I don't know, and there is differences in views among the Taliban about the peace process. Certainly the political office in Doha and also the top Taliban leadership continues to say that they will look to the possibility of talks with the Afghan state after the foreign forces have gone. But then again, you also have commanders on the battlefield, as well as foot soldiers, who have been doing all these interviews with the foreign media in which they say that we're ready to conquer. It's just a matter of time before we move in and conquer Afghanistan and install our emirate. So I think that the Taliban itself doesn't exactly know what it wants to do. But bottom line is that there's not going to be any forward movement in the peace process in the immediate term.
And then, no doubt, it would become very fluid. Now, of course, we mustn't forget that the United States forces are just one part of the coalition that's been in Afghanistan for the last years. I think that something like 30 countries have been involved, with another 7,500 remaining, 2,000 of which are Turkish troops. And a recent agreement between Turkey and with the support of the United States and the Afghan government has been for Turkey to offer the security of Kabul International Airport. How important is this step?
Well, it's a very important offer, for sure, just because this airport is going to become crucial, incredibly crucial for all remaining foreigners, including those from NATO countries in Afghanistan after the withdrawal is done. I mean, this is really the only way that foreign diplomats and aid workers will be able to get into and leave the country. And especially, I think that for many in Washington and other NATO capitals, there's a fear that after the withdrawal is done, the the security situation will really get out of control, and there's a chance that there will need to be rapid evacuations of foreign diplomats. And obviously, they will need a safe airport in order to be evacuated from Kabul and from Afghanistan. So I think that there's not enough trust among the NATO countries, not enough trust that the Afghan security forces can secure the entire government, the entire airport on their own. And that's why I think, despite the much-known tensions between the U.S. and Turkey, I think the U.S. very much supports the offer and would like Turkish troops to stay on and provide that role. The challenge, though, is that the Taliban has issued a public statement in which it has said that, no, we're not going to have that happen. It's rejected the idea of Turkish troops staying on just because they are foreign troops. And the Taliban has said repeatedly that all foreign forces, especially NATO forces, must be out of the country. No exception. So that's going to be a tough thing to see if the various players can negotiate that to somehow convince the Taliban to let these Turkish troops stay in the country. It'll be a hard sell, though, I think, because the Taliban has been very consistent and categorical in rejecting the possibility of any residual foreign troop presence in Afghanistan.
But if any were to be accepted, Turkey has had a long role in Afghanistan that has been generally welcomed by the Afghani people, I believe.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The Turkey has a long-standing relationship with Afghanistan. Its relationship with the government is in a good place. I believe this year they just marked their 100 years of formal relations. And the Taliban itself has said many times that it respects Turkey. It's referred to it frequently as a great Islamic nation. So absolutely. And you look at what Turkey has done. I mean, set aside the role at the airport. Turkey has trained thousands of Afghan troops over the years, so it's played that role. And it also has played a role as a convener. It has hosted some meetings with Taliban and with Afghan political players over the years, going back quite a number of years, in fact. And Turkey, of course, has played a significant role in some of these regional peace efforts. It's worked in a number of forums with Pakistan and Afghanistan. As you probably know, it helped found the Heart of Asia Istanbul process, which is a regional grouping that focuses on Afghanistan. So I see, even if it doesn't work out with Turkish troops continuing to provide security for the airport, I see opportunities for Turkey on the diplomatic side in terms of playing a role in the peace process, and also in trying to mediate tensions between other key players, such as the Afghan government and the Pakistani government.
Well, as you say, a lot can happen in a short period of time in politics. 2.5 months still to go before the September 11th deadline. Interesting to see what happens. Michael Kugelman, thank you so much for joining me today here on The Edge and giving us your perspective. Thank you. Now, Turkey has committed to securing Kabul airport once US forces withdraw. Its presence in Afghanistan is based on strong cultural and historic ties. The Americans will also be providing support to the Turks in their operations in Afghanistan if the mission is approved. The coming weeks will show how the process develops with regard to the Afghan peace process. But now let's move on to our next topic, a continuing global problem, namely the coronavirus pandemic. EU countries have agreed on a common approach to temporary restrictions on travel into the EU and the lifting of these restrictions. Our following infographic has the main facts. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he expects the United Kingdom to lift COVID-19 restrictions as planned next month, despite once again facing public criticism following the publication of a revealing WhatsApp exchange.
So when you put them in there...
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he's confident the UK will be able to lift remaining coronavirus restrictions on his new target date of July the 19th, despite a series of setbacks this year.
I'm very confident that we'll be able to go through with step 4 of the roadmap on the timetable that I've set out, with treating July the 19th, as I've said, as a terminus date. I think that's certainly what the data continues to indicate.
Johnson also said that while his priority was public health, he would look to work with Europe's soccer governing body, UEFA, over plans to host the Euro 2020 final in July. Johnson also said that he had complete confidence in his health secretary, despite a widely published expletive-filled message exchange showing the British leader branding Matt Hancock totally hopeless.
I have complete confidence in Matt, and indeed all of the government who've been dealing with COVID throughout the pandemic. And I think that when you look at the vaccine rollout that has been delivered by the NHS, it is absolutely outstanding.
And I'm joined live from Bath in the United Kingdom by Dr. Bharat Pankhania, who's a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Dr. Pankhania, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge from my favourite city in the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
Today was going to be a big day for the UK. The 21st of June was going to be the lifting of restrictions, and now we're hearing the 19th of July. Now, obviously dates are important for people because they want to have something to look forward to, but what is the reality?
So the reality is, unfortunately, the Delta variant was allowed to seed the United Kingdom population. Having started its seeding process with lots of people returning from India, the train was set into motion. And as this variant, Delta variant, is much more infectious, we've got a rising number of cases, and the rising number of cases in the unimmunized group. So what we have to do is use the break, i.e. the delay in removing the restrictions, to do our homework. And the homework that we must do is immunize as many people as possible in the other age groups that have not been immunized. That will buy us a bigger safety net, and that is what we're going to hope. And finally, what we hope is that with a large population immunized, we will be able to have the disconnection between rising number of cases not mirroring a rising number of hospitalizations. And when we reach that safety line, it would be much easier to say we lift restrictions.
Now, here in Turkey, as in the UK, the number of people being vaccinated is going up. I'm very grateful I got my second dose of vaccine last week, and the procedure continues on. Now, have we yet seen or what are the effects that we've seen from large numbers of population being vaccinated, using the UK as an example? Or what are the effects of the vaccination campaigns?
The vaccines are working very well. It is stopping people from entering ICU, intensive care units. That is what we want. And by and large, it is protective, and it is protective against all the variants that we've now come across. So it's very good, it's very effective, and I feel that for planet Earth, vaccines are the only way out. But the trouble is, if we don't hurry up and immunize other parts of the world, any day, any time, we could get a variant which bypasses the vaccines, and that would put us back to square one, unfortunately.
And this is a very important point, isn't it? We know that there's the COVAX scheme. Last week, the G7 made the big announcement of 1 billion doses, which sounds like a very large number. You say Africa is in dire situation with vaccinations. So again, the same question: what is the reality there?
So the reality is dire in Africa. We have no capacity or minimal capacity in intensive care units, very poor supply of vaccines and poor uptake of the vaccines, and shortage of fundamentals like oxygen. So whilst the media is not there, the situation in Africa is pretty dire. And for the G7 countries, the world's richest nations, to offer 1 billion vaccines sometime in the future is not good enough. They need to offer many more doses, and as fast as possible. It is in the interest of their own in case variants arise, and it's also a humanitarian thing to do, which is not only immunize your country, but allow other countries to also have a level of protection via the vaccines.
And so this protection of if not your neighbour, but the person down the street, is actually protection of yourself, because they're not going to come and bring something, some new mutation. So, absolutely, and
we really need to learn that the world is one family and act as such.
And so, what does is the problem caused by the fact that not enough vaccines are being produced, or that some countries are still holding on to doses that they have no intention of using, or they're trying to get the 100% vaccination of their own population before sharing a bit with somebody else? Well, what's the main sticking point, do you think?
All of them are sticking points. So there is a shortage of vaccines. We know that. And then there is the big players with the money, the deep pockets. So they've put in advance orders and purchased billions of doses, and they hold on to them and they say, we're going to immunize our population. It takes a very brave and good politician to say, we're going to immunize us, and we're also going to enable others to be immunized simultaneously. Norway was a great example of saying, we're going to immunize the rest of the world as well, rather than just immunize ourselves. So we need to do that. And then there is this thing of the patents. So the vaccine manufacturers have the monopoly on making the vaccines. And I say this, going forward, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months from today, we will need the vaccines. And therefore, the sooner the patents are relaxed and enable other people under license, under supervision, under scrutiny to also manufacture vaccines, it won't improve things. So we need to enable other people, other countries to also manufacture the vaccines.
What about moving on from vaccinations? Let's talk about some other behaviours. Summer is coming, so everybody wants to get outside and they want to get some fresh air. Many want to travel. What about general things? Firstly, is travel a bad idea? And alongside that, people that have been immunised, should they be still wearing masks?
Yes, good question. So with respect to people who have been fully immunized, we know that they are less infectious. The issue is we have a large number of people still to be immunized. So it becomes very difficult to say we've now got a cohort of people who are now exempt from wearing masks. But that good time will come very soon when we will be able to say viral activity is low, case numbers are low, you may not wear your masks, especially in sensitive areas, because you're unlikely to be infected and infectious. That time will come. At the moment, it's very difficult to say you have been immunized, therefore you don't need to wear a mask. With respect to travel, the issues are, upon your return, you may introduce a variant that causes a lot of harm in your country. The other issue is when you go abroad, you may also take variants from the UK to other distant parts of the world where they are not able to manage a rapidly spreading, highly infectious variant. So those are all the issues. And of course, another one is you may overwhelm somebody else's healthcare system. So at the moment, travel, for the reasons I have stated, is a little bit tricky, especially into poorer countries. Mm-hmm.
So again, it's thinking about the other before yourself, and maybe just being a little bit patient is the sensible way forward.
Yes.
What about some good news? I understand that some new treatments are being discovered on some monoclonal, if that's the right word, treatments are being discovered to help people recover from coronavirus. So we're still learning about many things. So what's the good news on the treatment front?
Oh, there's several lines of good news. One is, of course, the vaccines. The other is there is work going on antiviral blockers. That will come along, and there's a lot of work going on. And then with respect to the monoclonal antibodies, that's also very good news, which is we can manufacture antibodies, very specific antibodies, in the laboratory. And if we catch somebody who is a case and ill early enough, and then the early administration of these laboratory-made antibodies is proving effective. But the thing with monoclonal antibodies or any antibodies is the sooner it is given, the better. So the trick there is to always watch, to always catch the case as fast as possible, and then give them the monoclonal antibodies, but it has to be given as early as possible. So
there again, it's all about giving great respect to all the medics that are researching into this. Just as a final summary, but about a minute left, half a minute left. What are the key things that we should be doing?
So we need to immunize. We need to immunize the rest of the world. In the meantime, don't drop your guard. Wear a better quality mask to prevent yourself from getting infected, especially if you have not been immunized as yet. Good times will come, and I must emphasize, good times will come.
And we can enjoy the party maybe next year. Dr. Barad Pankhania, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been fascinating speaking with you. Thank you very much. Travellers and companies all over the world are hoping for the easing of restrictions, especially during the summer travel season, as the travel industry is the most affected by the pandemic. We all hope that vaccination efforts all over the world will bring an end to the pandemic so that people can once more travel freely without restrictions. But we should listen very carefully to the advice of our doctor. But for now, let's move on to our final topic to discuss the latest report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees regarding the soaring displacement of people. According to the Global Trends 2020 report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the number fleeing wars, violence and persecution in 2020 exceeded 82 million, despite the coronavirus pandemic. Our following infographic explains. Despite the ongoing pandemic, the fallout from a number of global conflicts is increasing the number of displaced peoples driven from their homes by violence.
The UN Refugee Agency is urging world leaders to step up their efforts to foster peace, stability and cooperation in order to halt and begin reversing nearly a decade-long trend of surging displacement driven by violence and persecution. The UNHCR's latest annual Global Trends report showed that despite the pandemic, the number of people fleeing wars, violence, persecution and human rights violations in 2020 rose to nearly 82.4 million people. Girls and boys under the age of 18 account for 42% of all forcibly displaced people, while they are particularly vulnerable, especially when crises continue for years. The report also notes that at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, over 160 countries had closed their borders, with 99 states making no exception for people seeking protection. While people continued to flee across borders, millions more were displaced within their own countries, driven mostly by crises in Ethiopia, Sudan, the Sahel countries, Mozambique, Yemen, Afghanistan and Colombia.
And I'm joined live from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia by Elizabeth Arnsdorf-Hasland, who's a spokesperson for the United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. Sorry, my brain froze. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today here on The Edge. So we've seen the global trends published by the UNHCR. Could you just very briefly, what was the purpose of this report and what are its biggest highlights?
This is a report that UNHCR has published for several years, for many years now, every year, to show the status in the world of forcibly displaced people, refugees, internally displaced people, asylum seekers. And what we are unfortunately seeing year after year now, the 9th year in a consecutive row, is that the numbers are soaring and going up. We saw it in your infographic right before. So it's more than 82 million people across the globe who have been forced from their homes. And this is more than 1% of humanity today.
And indeed, in the last 10 years, I think that number has actually doubled, which is a shocking statistic.
Exactly. It has more than doubled since 10 years ago. And I think, if people, following the news, we hear about these conflicts that continue to drive displacement. And what we see is that the conflicts are dragging on for years on end. We have a displacement crisis from Afghanistan and Somalia that have been going on for decades. Syria, now the conflict here is in its 10th year. Try look at the youngest nation on the planet, South Sudan, a country that has seen more war than peace. So we have some new conflicts that arise, but also a lot of conflicts that are dragging on for years, which also means, unfortunately, that we are seeing so many protracted crises where children, women, or men are living in displacement for sometimes generations.
And one of the very interesting things is that sometimes the host nations themselves, for many refugees, are also the victims of displacement internally. For example, I understand in Ethiopia, we know that the situation in the Tigray region with the conflict that's ongoing there, but at the same time, Ethiopia is the host nation for many displaced people as well. Could you explain to us the particular Ethiopian situation?
Yes, you are quite right. So, of course, there is currently a conflict going on in the northern part of Ethiopia, in Tigray region, that has displaced many people. It's estimated that 1.7 million have been displaced during this conflict that has now been going on for more than 7 months. But if we look at Ethiopia, then this country is the third largest refugee hosting country on the African continent. So Ethiopia is at the same time home to more than 800,000 refugees, the majority from South Sudan, from Somalia, from Eritrea, Sudan, but also other nationalities. So it's a very complex situation, and also because, again, we are having situations here in Ethiopia that have been lasting for years. In the Somali region, we have refugees from Somalia who has been here for more than 10 years, somebody even longer. But at the same time, we are also still seeing some new arrivals. There are still refugees fleeing violence and persecution in South Sudan who are crossing the border into Ethiopia. So all of this, of course, makes for a very complex and difficult situation.
And of course, that's compounded by I imagine, by the threats of humanitarian crisis, of hunger, of availability of food for people, as well as water and so on and so forth. There was only, I remember, as a teenager, 40 years ago, that the drought in Ethiopia and the immense humanitarian need at that time. Is this history repeating itself in the 2020s?
Well, it's not for me to try and draw parallels back to back then. But of course, what we are seeing, and this is not only in Ethiopia, this is unfortunately in many places of the world where countries and regions are hosting refugees and displaced people. We see this, let's say, dangerous mix of a lot of factors that intertwined are driving displacement. So you have conflict, persecution, and violence, but then at the same time, consequences of climate change, drought, floods, food insecurity, and then now we also have another exacerbating factor, which is a global pandemic. So a lot of factors are playing a role and is driving displacement in many of these, let's say, to begin with, vulnerable regions where already there has been conflict happening for some time, and then these other factors are driving it up or is amplifying the conflict that are forcing people to flee.
So there are many different causes, and sadly, nobody wants to be a refugee. Nobody wants to leave their home, the neighbourhood where they grew up, the place, the trees, the smells of their homeland. Nobody wants to leave that. We've seen here in Turkey, many have come from Syria and been displaced into Turkey. Over nearly 4 million people, I think, in the country here, and Turkey has been very welcoming to those. But that isn't the case all over the world. I think one thing I want to ask you, I don't want to put you into a political corner or anything, but what I want to ask you is, in many countries, people look at refugees, they look at asylum seekers, and they almost want to spit on them and say, "What are you doing here? We don't want people like you. Go away." But the reality for people who have had to leave their homes is something that they haven't want to leave behind, isn't it? So can you tell us about that pain?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the key messages here is that refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, these are human beings. These are people like everybody else, people who have dreams, who have hopes, who have ambitions, who wants to take care of their families, who wants to work and to build a future. And this is, I think, what we are sometimes seeing, unfortunately, many places, is that refugees are being reduced to a number or a statistic. And now I'm also talking about statistics today, and statistics that are so high that they are almost incomprehensible. But it is exactly what we need to remember, that behind every number is a human being. And just like you said, we know that the vast majority of refugees, they are just hoping to be able to return home when it's safe and it's secure, and they are able to do that. And I think that's for many of the refugees that I have met here in Ethiopia, but also in other countries. I think for many of them, one of the worst things is the uncertainty about the future. Imagine if you could not plan anything because you don't know what will happen. Will I be able to go home? When will I be able to go home? What will I go home to? These uncertainties is definitely one of the things that I hear again and again from many refugees, that is one of the most difficult things, not knowing what the future will bring. And that is also one of the reasons why it's so important, and this is one of the calls from UNHCR. It's so important for countries to make sure that refugees who have sought safety in their countries are being included in society so that they are able to lead as normal lives as possible, so that we make sure that refugees are able to be educated, that they are able to work, to provide for their families, and to contribute to those societies who are generously hosting them.
In fact, the reality is that many refugees have made huge contributions to the communities they've later joined. These include professional people, they include athletes, don't they? They include people from all walks of life.
Exactly. And again, that just means we cannot look at refugees as one group. These are just normal people who has been in that horrible situation that they have been forced to flee their homes because of violence, war, conflict, and persecution because of who they are, their ethnicity, their religion, their political ideology. But these are normal people, and we need to remember that every time we hear about refugees and asylum seekers.
So a refugee could be somebody like you, could be somebody like me, or somebody else here. Elizabeth ALJAZZAR, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you. Solutions to the soaring displacement require global leaders who can put aside their differences in order to solve the conflict and ensure a safe environment for people. So we've been joined by our analysts from around the world who provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. So before closing our programme, let's take a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top story, shared with the hashtag refugees. So let's have a look, let's see what you had to write about refugees on Twitter. Mundo said almost 8 months of Tigray genocide and a manufactured famine besieged the people of Tigray. Refugee camps are struggling to provide necessary care to women and children in Sudan. The international community must do more to protect Tigrayans. And Sadiq Zafrullah says, energy is a basic need for me, for you and for everyone else. Refugees and displaced people have limited or no access to energy at all. Can you imagine? Martin Wrench says, global displacement is soaring and millions of refugees are facing hunger and uncertainty as the effects of COVID-19 on aid budgets play out in funding shortages for emergency operations. Let's now take a look at our video of the day, which tells the story of children who were born into refugee life. And that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boynes. Stay tuned as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.